Hello, my friends. I am Joe Harper, and this is Reformed Truther Ministries. The topic of today's video is Interacting with Falling Flat, Part 3. So, I have been going through in this series of videos the book by Dr. Danny Faulkner titled Falling Flat. And this book is a refutation of flat earth claims. So I am an individual, for those who have not watched part 1 and 2, who holds to what I like to call biblical cosmology, or what is more commonly known as the flat earth position. And I am making the case that this can be demonstrated historically, biblically, or scripturally, and also empirically or scientifically, and that there is false science, or science falsely so called, if I want to quote the Bible, that is used to try to make the case against the flat earth, but that true empirical observation or a true understanding of the progression of this debate historically, and most importantly, a true understanding of God's word, the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, teaches us that the world that we live on is a flat and stationary plane encased by a covering that is called the firmament. So that is what we've been going through in this series. And what I have been trying to do is demonstrate that this book, which is held up as the gold standard by many prominent evangelical churches or ministries or pastors today, in fact, is a book that fails to not only refute flat earth, but it even fails to accurately represent the issues at all. So in part 1, just to review real quick before we get into our subject matter for today, part 1, I went through really what the book is. We really started just with the front cover, the back cover, a little bit of who Faulkner was and is, who Faulkner is, excuse me. And we talked about how Faulkner, he uses straw man arguments. We talked about that. We talked about how he fails to accurately represent the issues. And we talked about how he is just generally unreliable as a source on this issue. And even though that offended some people who let me know that in the comments, that is the case that I made. And so in part 1, we really went from the front cover to the back cover, and we read some excerpts from the introduction of the book, and then we got specifically into the historical views of Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Martin Luther. And I gave specific quotations from their writings in refutations of the views that Faulkner laid out and all that. So that's really where I started. Now that I've decided to turn it into a series, last week I did part 2, and I decided to organize the material into 3 sections, which is the historical. That's what we're going to hopefully finish up today. And then we are going to move forward to the biblical, and then finally the empirical arguments. So that's really what we're going through. Last week in part 2, we talked about the views of the ancient world, and specifically the views of the ancient Near East. And I documented and showed how the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Egyptians held to a flat earth cosmology. And most importantly, we talked about how the ancient Hebrews held to a flat earth cosmology. And we talked about how that's relevant, or that's important, because that would be the worldview of the peoples who, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wrote the Old Testament, even the New Testament. And we talked about how Faulkner misrepresented the views of the quotation from Josephus in his first century work, his works, his writings. And we talked about not only the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Hebrew views of cosmology, but we talked about the ancient Greeks. And I went to the writings of Herodotus to show that he's an example of someone who held to a flat earth cosmology. And even though Herodotus is remembered primarily as a historian, when you read his histories, he went into extensive detail describing his views on geography and his views on the world as a whole. And so we talked about that last week. And then we agreed with the fact that Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, these are prominent Greek philosophers from history, and these were very intelligent men, that they did introduce this idea of a globe into the world, and that some of their followers, or many of their followers, did hold these views, and these views were held by whatever term we want to use, some people or many people in the Hellenized world. But we also made the case that their views were not universally held. So we can debate to how far that went, but we're saying, and I showed, that not everybody held those views. We demonstrated that and documented that through 2 whole videos now. And that really brings us up to what we're going to cover today. And today we're going to be focusing more on the medieval era. And we're going to be talking about Isidore of Seville. And he is somebody who operated in the 6th and 7th centuries. And we're going to be looking at some medieval maps today. And we're going to be talking about the views of John Calvin. We already covered Luther, so we're going to talk about John Calvin. And really the point I want to make before we get further into our material here in just a moment is that we're seeing that the introduction of a globe happened gradually throughout history. And what I am saying is that, yes, these ideas were introduced by some of these ancient Greek philosophers and and also some of their followers, and that those views held some level of prevalence. We can debate how widely or how narrowly those views were held. And we can then talk about how many people, I'm going to document how many people in the medieval era believed in the flat earth. And we're going to see this from the writings and from the maps. And we already quoted Aquinas to show that. But there were some even at that time who held it. But it really is not until the 15th century, the late 15th century and the early 16th century, where this idea of the globe, and then by extension also the heliocentric worldview, starts to really pick up steam. Those are two separate concepts, by the way, but they're interconnected concepts because there are people who believe in a globe who can hold two different forms of geocentricity or geocentrism. And then there are people who would hold to heliocentrism. But those are ideas that start to come about really roughly in the last 500 years, and that is where they have really picked up steam. And this is a concept that we're going to see that Danny Faulkner wants to, he rejects, and he wants us to reject it as well. He wants us to believe that essentially anybody, with a few notable exceptions, anybody of intelligence or anybody of any historical prevalence throughout all this time that I've just talked about, held to the globe theory. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today when we get to the views of Christopher Columbus is he's going to try to make the case that the view of history regarding Columbus that has historically been taught is wrong. He's saying that because, the traditional story is that Columbus believed that the earth was a globe and he had to fight his critics who held to the flat earth in order to justify his voyages. And Faulkner is now saying that, well, no, that's not what it was about at all. He's saying that everybody essentially already held to the globe, and therefore he's saying that this story has been misrepresented. They'll say that some people will now say that the debate was only over the size of the earth and whether he could get to the east by sailing west and all the rest of it. But Faulkner's making the case, and this is really a view that's being pushed now by modern historians, is that everybody believed that the earth is a globe. And I'm going to demonstrate, and I believe that this is a really historical revisionism, in that when we look at some writings today, we're going to see that the goalposts of that story specifically have been changed. So we're going to get into that today, and I'm hoping that today that this will put the capstone on the historical section of this series, and then we can begin to move forward into the biblical section. So all of that being said, by way of introduction, I have 4 things I'm going to cover for the rest of this video. First is Isidore of Seville, who I just mentioned. We're going to look at some medieval maps. And then we're going to talk about Christopher Columbus, who I just mentioned, and we're going to finish with John Calvin. So 4 sections today. And we'll be showing as we go along how Faulkner represents these things, and then we'll show once again how he misrepresents these things. So let's start with some background information on Isidore of Seville. He was the Archbishop of Seville. This is in Spain. And he was born in the year 560 AD, and he died in the year 636 AD. And so this would be after the fall of the Roman Empire. And he was a very learned man. He was considered one of the last bastions of holding up the torch of classical learning in that post-Roman world, of that ancient world. This is before we move deeper into the medieval era, or what has been called the Dark Ages. So Isidore of Seville was not only a prominent bishop, but he was also a prominent intellectual who was willing to cover more secular topics. Not secular in the more modern sense of being anti-Christian, but what I'm saying is that he wrote about things that went beyond just biblical or theological themes. So Isidore of Seville, he wrote 2 prominent works, and both of them talk about the world, and it plays into our debate on cosmology. The first is on the nature of things, and the second is on etymologies. So I'm going to show here that first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to quote what Faulkner says about Isidore of Seville. He says that he believed in a globe. And then I'm going to quote from Seville's writings himself in these two books. These two works are once again On the Nature of Things is his first prominent work. And the second one is Etymology. So we're going to quote Faulkner, and then we're going to quote his actual writings themselves. And then we're going to quote from an article it's called the Bede Journal Blogspot. And this article is very well done. I'm going to post this in the description. It's going to state how, when you really look at the context of what Isidore of Seville wrote, and then even if you have some understanding of the Latin word orbis, that can be translated as a globe, but it also can be translated as a disc. What this article is going to show us or demonstrate is that Isidore of Seville, most likely, I would say very likely, actually held to a flat Earth cosmology. And I think we'll even be able to show that from his writings. So we're going to once again make the case that Faulkner misrepresented this individual just like he did with Luther, Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas. So Isidore of Seville, this is page 33 of the book Falling Flat, and this is what Faulkner has to say. It's very short. Isidore of Seville, early 7th century, wrote about the earth being spherical in his On the Nature of Things. And then he goes on to list other people, and I'm not going to be able to cover all these other individuals for the sake of time, but I'll just read this. He says, in his On the Reckoning of Time, the Venerable Bede, early 8th century, taught that the earth is spherical. And then in his Opus Majus, Roger Bacon, 13th century, indicated a belief that the earth is spherical. So he's going through some medieval people here. We're going to focus on Isidore of Seville, early 7th century. So he says Seville believed in a globe. That's the statement. And I'd quote more from Faulkner on Isidore of Seville, but he doesn't have anything else in his. This is the only reference we have to him in his book. And I wasn't even going to cover him, but I was just doing my research, and I found good evidence to say, oh, this guy, I was going to concede, okay, maybe that some of these guys, these early medieval guys, did hold to the globe, and I found evidence for him to say, hey, he believed actually in a flat Earth cosmology. So that's where we're gonna go here, because the evidence points that out. So let's start by going through these works. So we're going to start. We're going to start with On the Nature of Things, and forgive me if it takes me a moment to get this pulled up. Okay. And then we'll quote from his Etymologies, which I think will give more context to the views of Isidore of Seville. And this is what he says. He says, in definition, the philosophers say there are 5 circles of the world. That is zone, what the Greeks called parallels, in which the orb of the earth is divided. Virgil demonstrates states these in the Georgic, saying 5 zones occupy the sky, but we imagine them in such a way as our right hand, so that the thumb is the Arctic circle, uninhabitable with cold. The second circle is estival, inhabitable and temperate. The middle one, equinoxial, uninhabitable and hot. And the fourth circle is haverval, temperate and habitable. The last one is the Antarctic, frigid and uninhabitable. So you could read this and you could say, well, he calls the earth an orb. And you would say, oh, okay, so he's clearly talking about a globe or a sphere. And then you could think of these zones in the sense of being kind of similar to like the lines such as the equator. And you could read this quotation in that lens. But if you understand that the Latin word orbis, which here has been translated orb, it can be translated as orb, or it can be translated as a disc. And the article I'm going to read here in a bit will say that. And that can completely change the view, because then he talks about the Arctic and the Antarctic. and he talks about the middle being inhabitable, it can take on a clearly different spin. I think the later quotations will be clear on this, but I wanted to include this quotation because I want to make sure that I give enough information to objectively show what he wrote. I don't want to cherry pick, but I think it's going to be clearer here in his etymologies next. So the next thing we're going to go to is Isidore of Seville's work on, once again, his work etymology. And you're going to have to forgive me once again. I've said this in all three of these videos now, but these videos are massive information dumps, and therefore, because I have to interact with the material in this way, I'm required to do a lot of reading, which when I do videos normally speaking on things or doing videos on topics, I'll usually try to be selective about what I choose to read because I know it can be tiresome for people to listen to constant reading of quotations. But with this subject matter, when you have to really, this debate is so contentious, you have to cross all your T's and dot all your I's. It's just necessary. You really have to prove and document almost everything that you say because otherwise you're just going to get picked apart. And so it's necessary to basically any statement I make about these people's views, you have to give documentation for everything. So that's why there's so much reading in these videos. So I'm going to start with, this is what he says about the world. And this is interesting. So he says that this is his book, and this is considered his magnus opus, by the way, his book Etymologies. And this is kind of an encyclopedic work because it goes through different subjects and it has article. It's very, very much like an encyclopedia, and it goes through, he'll talk about defining what the world is, seas, rivers, the abyss, the sky, the stars, the sun. It's very much defining these things. That's really what this book is. It's not the type of book that you would read like a historical biography or like a fictional work or a narrative in that sense. It is very much encyclopedic. So on the world, this is what Isidore of Seville says. He says, the world consists of the sky and the land and the sea and the creations of God within them. Whence it is said, John 1:10, and quote, and the world was made by him. The world, or mundus, is named thus in Latin by the philosophers because it is in eternal motion, as are the sky, the sun, the moon, the air, and the seas. Thus, no rest is allowed to its elements on this account that it is always in motion. Whence to Varro, the elements seem to be animate because he says they move of their own accord. But the Greeks adopted a term for the world, mundus, also meaning cosmetics, derived from the ornament on the account of the diversity of elements and the beauty of the heavenly body. They call it cosmos, which means ornament. For our bodily eyes, we see nothing more beautiful than the world. There are 4 zones in the world, that is 4 regions, the east and the west and the north and the south. The east, or Oriens, is named from the rising exortus of the sun. The west is named because it makes the day set and perish, for it hides the light in from the world and brings on darkness. The north is called from the 7 septum stars, North Pole and the Big Dipper, which wheel as they rotate around it. Strictly speaking, this is called the vertex, i.e. celestial pole, because it turns as the poet says. The south, or meritus, is so named either because of the sun makes midday, medium deum, and as if the word were medide, or because at the time the ether sparkles more purely, for meris means pure. The sky has 2 portals, the east and the west, for the sun enters in through one portal and withdraws through the other. The world has 2 poles, the north and the sky, for the south revolves around them. Now you may see you may think that he's talked about the mundus, or the world. This is separate. He defines this separately from the earth, which is the dry earth. This is interesting. This is a good example of how things can be misunderstood if you're not careful, because he said the world, or the mundus, is constantly in motion. Now what you need to understand in the Latin is that the word mundus, or world, can be translated as you could think of it as the earth, or you could think of it as the whole universe or the whole creation. So this text here, and we'll read this in this article we're going to read from this Bede journal, says this exact thing. So that's very interesting. But he's talking about how the world has these 4 zones, the north, south, east, and west. And then he talks about these portals for the sun and such. And so that's all very interesting. But I wanted to start with that section here. And scrolling down to the next one, I want where he talks specifically about the earth. And I think this will be pretty interesting for everybody. Okay, right. Yeah, right here. So this part is in book 14 of his etymologies, and this is the earth and its part. Now listen specifically to what Isidore of Seville says. He says the earth is placed in the earth is placed in the central region of the world. So you see how the earth is distinguished from the world that we just talked about earlier. The earth is placed in the central region of the world, standing fast in the center, equidistant from all other parts of the sky. In the singular, the word earth, terra, signifies the whole globe. Now remember what I talked about, how that word orbis can be globe or disk, but in the plural, distinct part. Logic supplies the earth's diverse names, for the word terra is derived from the upper surface that is worn away, terrari. Soil, humus, from the lower or moist, humidus, earth, like that under the sea, ground, tellus. But we carry away, talare, which it produces as such, which is called ops, i.e. the earth goddess of plenty, because it produces wealth from its crops and also arable land from plowing and cultivating. However, to distinguish it properly from water, it is called dry land, as scripture says in Genesis 1:10. God called the dry land earth. The earth's natural attribute is that of dryness, for if it is moist, it comes from the union with water, or if motion say that it is the wind that hollows itself moves the earth. A number of mountains and hills subsided, sundered by the wind rushing through the hollows of the earth. Other maintain that life-giving waters move in the earth and simultaneously shakes like a vessel. For instance, Lucretius see on the nature of things, yet other are of the opinion that the earth is spongy, and that is mostly hidden, collapsing interior shakes everything placed upon it. Also, an opening of the earth is created through the movement of waters in the lower regions, or through winds that erupt in the cavities of the earth. Now listen to this part. This section is, once again, the Latin word orbis, the globe. The globe derives its name from the roundness of the circle because it resembles a wheel. Hence, a small wheel is called, quote, a small disc. Indeed, the ocean that flows around it on all sides encompasses its furthest reach in a circle. And it is divided into 3 parts. One is called Asia, the second Europe, the third Africa. The ancients did not divide the 3 parts of the globe equally, for Asia extends from south to north in the east, but Europe from north to the west, Africa from west to the south. It is clear that 2 of them, Europe and Africa, occupy half of the globe. Asia, the other half by itself, but the former pair were divided into 2 regions from the ocean. The Mediterranean enters in between them and separates them. Wherefore, if you divide the globe into 2 parts, the east and the west, Asia will be in one, and Europe and Africa on the other. So you see there the globe, which is said explicitly in this quotation. It says globe, and then in parentheses it says orbis. Listen to this again. The globe, or in other words, the orbis, derives its name from the roundness of the circle because it resembles a wheel. Hence, a small wheel is called a small disc. So here in this English translation, it's translated as a globe, and we think of globe Earth. But when you read that quotation, it sounds a lot more like a disc. So you see what I'm getting at there. And just how the same way you could read that section on the mundus, the world, and said, oh, the mundus is constantly in motion. And you would think, oh, see, it's portraying our view of the universe. But when you understand the distinctions between the terra, the dry earth, and the mundus, which is referring to everything, you can see how his views, and this is a good lesson, a good case study for us in general when we study these guys. It's very interesting to understand how things can get misinterpreted when you read them. And I think that Faulkner, either through ignorance or through perhaps even through sophistry, has misrepresented Isidore of Seville, just like he has many others. So this article I'm gonna read from next. This is from what the website is called Bede Journal Blogspot, and this was posted Saturday, June 12th, 2021. And the title of this article is, Did Isidore of Seville Think the Earth is Flat? And yes, probably. I might only read some excerpts of this, but I'm going to include this entire article so you can read it in its section. So listen to this. Isidore of Seville, 560 to 636 AD, was one of the most influential authors of the early Middle Ages. And although he was a long-serving bishop, he wrote on secular subjects as well as religious ones. He's best known for his etymologies, an encyclopedia in 20 books organized around the word origins, but covering a great deal more besides. He also wrote a guide to natural philosophy called On the Nature of Things. The sources that Isidore used for these works were wide-ranging, encompassing both pagan and Christian literature. He was happy to mine pagan authors for useful information. He intended his books for a Christian audience seeking knowledge that was not remotely unorthodox. That meant that when his pagan sources conflicted with his Christian ones, he would invariably prefer the latter. But sometimes he must have found it hard to determine which side to favor. The shape of the earth was one area of uncertainty. So that context that we had before about how the Greeks introduced these ideas in, but then there were people who rejected those ideas, that plays into what we're going to read next. Continuing on, historians have long known that medieval Europeans were well aware that the earth is a sphere. Now, this guy's not a flat earther. This runs contrary to the popular view that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat until Columbus put them right. Medieval knowledge of the globe is hardly surprising. It was a near unanimous view of educated people in the Roman Empire that the earth was a sphere, and large numbers of extant ancient texts from Plato and Aristotle in the 4th century BC to Macrobius and Martianus Capella in the 5th century AD state this explicitly. However, Isidore lived in a period when the Western Roman Empire had collapsed and his native Spain was ruled by a barbarian dynasty of Visigoths. Isidore himself was instrumental in restoring knowledge of classical learning among the newly Christianized barbarian kingdoms. But in his own lifetime, that project was still a work in progress. Unlike the earlier pagan and Christian authors that he drew his knowledge from, he didn't benefit from a secular education on philosophy and the liberal arts. To a great extent, he was an autodidact. We cannot simply assume that he imbibed ancient natural philosophy wholesale. On the question of the shape of the earth, there is good evidence that he didn't. 40 years ago, W.M. Stevens in 1980 robustly defended the view that Isidore was a globalist, but more recent scholarship has swung the other way. In 1996, William McCready found that Isidore is at least conflicted on this point, while 20 years later, Andrew Fear stated, quote, the notion of the flat earth runs throughout Isidore's On the Nature of Things. Before we examine the text of etymologies and On the Nature of Things in detail, we need to consider some foibles from the Latin language. The first is the word orbis. It is natural to assume that this means orb. So if it is described as an orbis, that is tantamount to saying it is a globe. But although it could mean that orbis more usually means a disc. For example, Lactantius, a 4th century Christian writer who definitely thought that the earth was flat, referred to the earth as a, quote, orbis in his Divine Institutes. Unfortunately, modern translators often render orbis as globe, which, as well as being unclear linguistically, is also very misleading. Also, like English, Latin mixes and matches the word for the earth, terra, and the word for world, mundus. It is quite possible for mundus to refer to either the earth or the whole universe. We just have to figure it out from the context. Isn't that something? I'll read a bit more. It is not controversial that Isidore thought the universe is a sphere and the earth is at its center. He he drew much of his cosmological knowledge from a book called Astronomy by Hyginus, 17 AD. Unfortunately, this book is more concerned with the myths behind the constellations, but begins with a brief primer on cosmology. It is also clear that Isidore did not believe there are any antipodians, that is, people who live on the other side of the world. Indeed, he said this was physically impossible, as neither the solidity nor central place of the earth allows this. However, none of this tells us whether the earth itself is a globe. Some of the key passages are in Book 14 of Etymology. That's what I read from. Isidore started by telling us that the earth, Terra, is at the center of the universe, equidistant from all other parts. That is pretty much a verbatim quote from Hyginus. He noted that that Terra, or the earth, in the singular refers to the whole orbis. Now, orbis could be sphere or disk, but Isidore helpfully sorted out this confusion in the next paragraph. Orbis, he tells us, derives its name from the roundness of the circle because it resembles a wheel. This seems clear enough, but then he muddied the waters by quoting Hyginus again, that the ocean flows around the orbis on all sides, encompassing on all sides, encompasses its furthest reaches in a circle. Then he notes that the orbis is split into 3 continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa. Now, if the orbis refers to the whole earth, that is a pretty accurate description of the traditional Greek world picture that imagined the earth was a flat disk girt by water and containing 3 continents arranged in a circle. However, in the 4th century, Aristotle explained that the earth is actually a sphere, so 3 continents became the inhabited world, occupying a band of the earth's sphere. The oikumene was still generally thought of as round, which irritated Aristotle, who thought it actually was a strip across the face of the whole earth, not a circle. So, I mean, I could stop here. He continues to go on to make the case that this is referring to. He's saying that the way we should understand Isidore of Seville is by understanding that he's using that word as a disc, or as a disc or a wheel, and not as a globe. And then he's saying, just as we looked at from the maps last week, that's what many of the Greeks believed as well. So that provides so much clarity to what is going on here. And I'm going to just read here a bit more from the context. He's this is scrolling down a bit, but this will kind of conclude it. So he says, ultimately, the fairest reading of Isidore is that his cosmology was similar to that of the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaxagoras, who said a flat earth is found at the center of a spherical universe supported by a cushion of air. Isidore himself wondered whether the earth was upheld by air or water on the nature of things. To read him otherwise requires us to interpret his work in a way that assumes we have already proved that he must support the globe. So I think that really gives a fair summation. So what we're saying is he could have held to a flat earth cosmology, but he might not have been very solid on this idea of the solid firmament that people who hold the biblical cosmology today, or other words, flat earth today, are advocating for. So that provides a lot of context to what he's reading. And there's one more thing I want to read from him. This is going back to his etymologies, but before I forget, I want to cover it because he actually talks about the deeps below. And we also saw how he rejected the idea of people living on the other side of the earth, or the antipodes, very similar to Augustine. But I'm going to quote here from, I was going to read this before and I forgot, but I want to cover it before we move forward to the maps. He talks about the depths of the waters, which when you read this, it provides a lot of context, I think, to what he's getting at. So he has a section on the waters, the sea, the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, tides and straits, lakes, ponds, and then here, this section on the abyss. And he says, the abyss is an impenetrable depths of waters, either caves of hidden waters from which springs and rivers rise, or that waters that secretly flow below the earth. Hence, it is called the abyss, fathomless, or from without. Indeed, all waters, even if they are torrents, return through the hidden passages to the central abyss. Surges are also named because they arise from blowing winds, for the waters are agitated by the force of winds or surge up. Aqua is water that is still and level without motion, but a wave is a wide water that is always in motion. So I thought that was interesting too, that he talks about these abysses of waters below. So that's a lot of information on Isidore of Seville, but I think it really covers what we're talking about here. So we're going to now move ahead to Columbus. And Christopher Columbus, I'm going to read a couple excerpts from Faulkner's book on him. One is on page 13 of his book, so this is earlier in the book. And this says, "Back to Columbus." So this is what Faulkner says about Christopher Columbus. And we're going to see that Faulkner is going to advocate for, Columbus believed that the earth was a globe, but everybody else already did anyway, and that view has been misrepresented. So that's what we're going to see Faulkner say, and then we're going to interact with that. So this is the words of Faulkner. He says, "Back to Columbus." And then under this section, it says, "Perhaps the rise of the flat earth movement is a symptom of a deeper problem. Far too much of our education system is geared toward rote memorization of facts without assimilation of those facts or reasoning to understand how people came to know those facts. Hence, it's understandable why most people know the earth is spherical, but don't know how we know this. This also explains why it is so easy for flat earth arguments to fluster so many people. But compounding the problem is that some of the things we think are true are not true or aren't true. An excellent example of this is what I call our Columbus mythology. Most of us grew up learning that Columbus thought the earth was spherical, so sailing westward from Europe to reach Asia was shorter and faster than traveling eastward. This wasn't just an academic exercise because Muslims had closed to Europeans the overland trade routes to the Far East. According to the story, nearly everyone opposed Columbus's rash plan because they believed that the earth was flat, so a foolhardy trip would end in disaster as falling off the edge of the earth. It makes for a good story, but it is not true. To the contrary, at least in the West, for 2,000 years before Columbus, nearly everyone had known that the earth was spherical. Most people today are astonished or astounded to learn this. Then what was the nature of the argument about Columbus's proposal? The dispute was over the size of the earth, not its shape. People knew that one could sail westward to reach the Far East, but the question was, why would you want to do that? Most people thought that there was a vast ocean all the way to Asia. They didn't know about the American continents yet, which would require a very long voyage across an open ocean without prospect of resupply. Vessels at that time were small and rarely traveled more than a few days out of sight of land. Besides concerns about resupply, there were also mere concerns for safety because if a problem developed, the crew had hope of limping back toward land even if they weren't far from land. Therefore, a voyage across a large unknown ocean was a very frightening thing, but not because of the fear of falling off the edge. So Faulkner saying everybody already believed that the earth was a globe, but he's saying the size of that travel to the Far East from Europe, that was what the debate was really about. Now, at this point, we need to understand that that is not what earlier historians said about Columbus. And he even admitted this to some extent. Because, yes, even the baby boomer generation and earlier, if you go back to the 1960s and 1950s in the school system, they taught that Columbus was advocating his globe view in the context of a world that was pushing back against him. That was even what was taught just a couple generations ago in our school system. And even though this isn't great proof, I'm going to include a little cartoon below Looney Tunes from 1951 where it shows Columbus advocating his round earth to the King of Spain. And then later he humorously, comes in contact with Bugs Bunny, and the King of Spain is ridiculing Columbus for promoting this globe view. And I'm showing this isn't a proof for what the correct story is, but it's a proof that was how it was taught. because you can say, yeah, in the 50s, this is what was being promoted in Hollywood, and it's also what was being promoted in the educational system. And I've talked to older people who said that. They would say, yeah, that's how we were taught about Columbus in school. There's still people alive today who can remember that's how things were taught. And now we're having these academics say, oh, that's not the story. So we'll get more into that in just a second. But I want to read a little bit more on Faulkner. So page 268 and 269. So listen to this. So he talks about this conflict thesis, and he basically says, I'm going to summarize his views. You can read this in the book in its entirety. But he says that in the 19th century, people who were attacking Christianity said they wanted to promote the belief that Christians used to ignorantly believe the earth is flat, and then these Columbus would be viewed as one of these heroes that helped start to demolish the ignorance of Christianity, and that there were 19th century people who were starting to promote this view. And this Faulkner has said that one of the reasons he wants to smash down flat earth is because he doesn't like that baggage. He doesn't want the Bible to be connected to flat earth. He's ashamed of that baggage. So he wants to get away from that. That's a part when we read the introduction in part 1 in the first video, that's a big reason why he said he's writing this book. But he talks about this conflict thesis that arises, and he talks about how the story of Columbus is an illustration of what went on with these historical debates. So listen to this. He says, the promoters of the conflict thesis also retold the story of Christopher Columbus. Most people today persist in the belief that at the time of Columbus, nearly everyone thought that the earth was flat. According to the story, Columbus was one of the few people who thought the earth was spherical, so he understood that on a spherical earth, one could sail westward from Europe to reach India and China. Supposedly, Columbus had to argue against strong objections coming from those who thought the earth was flat to get support for his expedition. Finally, according to the story, Columbus managed to complete a voyage to the New World, and when he returned to Europe, people realized that Columbus was right, that the world was round and not flat. Really? Question mark. How did sailing from Europe to the Caribbean and back to Europe prove that the earth was spherical? It didn't. That specific statement he just said, that's true, by the way. The truth is that no one told Columbus he could not reach the Far East by sailing west. Everyone knew it was possible because everyone knew that the earth was spherical. The problem was that the earth was very large. Most people understood the distance from westward to the Far East was far greater than going eastward. A look at any globe proves this. The question was not how possible it was to reach the Far East by going westward, but rather how feasible it was. The belief was that the ocean between Europe and Asia was so vast with little or no land in between. At the time of Columbus, voyages over open water were very risky, and ships sailed more than 1 or 3 days out of sight of land. A voyage westward across the ocean to Asia would have required months with no opportunity for resupply or rescue if problems had developed. The facts of history refute the commonly held story about Christopher Columbus. Much of the work supporting flat Earth today uncritically repeats and builds upon this false view. The flat Earth movement began in the 19th century, the same time that the conflict thesis was being developed. While the skeptics were ridiculing the Bible for allegedly teaching that the earth is flat, a few Christians foolishly accepted this false claim. Undoubtedly, the recent surge of interest in the flat earth amongst Christians has been fueled by this false belief that the Bible teaches that the earth is flat. I'm going to stop there. So you get a pretty good idea of what Faulkner's saying his belief is, and what his he's also where he's coming from. He's saying that this view about Columbus arose, and that it was these skeptics wanted to promote Columbus at these people who they themselves, these skeptics who were anti-Christian, who believed that the earth was a globe, that Columbus was right for believing a globe, and they wanted to use that story to hammer down Christianity because of the belief that the Bible taught the earth is flat. There's a lot there to flesh out that story of the 19th century. That would take more time. There's elements of truth in that, but there's misrepresentations of what Faulkner's saying too. But I'm going to quote from Let me turn to this here. But here, the next quote I'm going to read is from, it's a very famous biography of Christopher Columbus from Washington Irving, who it is from the 19th century. But I'm going to read this quotation here. And he's going to talk about how, yes, Columbus was debating the theologians in Spain about the shape of the earth, and that the Washington Irving is saying that these theologians were rebutting or pushing back against Columbus's view of the earth being a globe from scripture and from quoting past divines. And then we'll go for this, though. All right. I talked about this in my book. So my book, The Hidden Enemies, I went into this about Columbus. So let's see here. Okay, here we go. So the book I'm quoting from here. The excerpt is I quoted this in my own book called The Hidden Enemies, The Antichrist, the New World Order, and the True History of the World. But the book that I'm specifically quoting from is The History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. And the context of this quotation is that Columbus here is debating the Spanish theologians, but would be to justify his voyages to the West, and that he's debating them over the shape of the earth. So listen to what Washington Irving says here. So he says, thus at the very threshold of the discussion, instead of geographical objections, Columbus was assailed with citations from the Bible and the Testament, the book of Genesis, the Psalms of David, the prophets, the epistles, and the gospels. To these were added the expositions of various saints and reverend commentators, St. Chrysostom, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, Basil, Ambrose, and Lactantius, a redoubted champion of the faith. Doctrinal points were mixed up with philosophical discussions, and a mathematical demonstration was allowed no weight. If it appeared to clash with a text of scripture or a commentary on one of the fathers, thus the possibility of antipodes in the southern hemisphere, an opinion so generally maintained by the wisest of the ancients as to be proclaimed by Pliny the Great, contests the great and learned and the ignorant, because the great stumbling block was some of the sages of Salamanca. So what we got to understand here from this quotation is that Washington Irving, that he himself was an advocate of the globe model, and he sees that he's portraying Columbus as this great man who's debating these less wise Spanish theologians. So that's the context. So this guy's not friendly to flat earth. But the part about this quotation that interested me, and it's why I included it in my book, was because when you say, well, this man who must have done his own historical research, he was saying that Augustine, they quoted Augustine, they quoted the Bible to support their view, the Spanish theologians. They quoted Augustine. Well, we read Augustine ourselves. We know that Augustine did believe that. And then they talk about Jerome. We talked about how Jerome translated the word stereoma from the Greek Septuagint, or the word rakia from the book of Genesis in the Hebrew. Jerome translated that as firmamentum, which is a word that refers to something solid in regard to the firmament. And they talk about how these guys were quoting Lactantius, who even Faulkner himself conceded held to a flat earth. But what Faulkner did in his book is that he minimized how prominent of a theologian Lactantius was in his day. He was very prominent in the West. He was a prominent Western divine in the patristic era. But Faulkner, because that doesn't go along with what he said, he actually minimized that. And we talked about that. So the interesting thing about me is, so who's right? Is Faulkner's view of the right, or is Washington Irving writing in the 19th century right? Well, because Washington Irving, and that's the same view that was taught in the 20th centuries in the schools, that was the view put forward by the biographers in the 19th century. And I guess we could go into more and more source documentation. But when I read that quotation from Irving, in light of all the actual quotes that I've already demonstrated, I would say there's a lot of credence to say that his version makes sense. And the other thing is, Faulkner makes this claim that the story's been misrepresented, but he doesn't really give any reasons to show or demonstrate that the newer view of the story is the correct one. Now, for me, I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to go to the biblical section in our next series of videos here. So, you know, the people debating Columbus, what their specific people view, does it really make or break my view of cosmology? Whole no. But Faulkner's promoting this whole new view of what happened. I've said that this view of the globe came in gradually over time, and it accelerated around the time of Columbus. And I've said that I don't need to prove that everybody agreed with me to prove my greater point. Faulkner's saying that this view, that he wants to show that basically everybody of prominence held to the globe for 2,000 years. We read him say that. The burden of proof is on him. The quotations are not lining up with what he's saying. And it seems to me that he's saying, and other modern historians are saying this too, the debate was about the shape of the earth and not the size. But he hasn't really, in his book, Falling Flat, he makes that claim, but he doesn't have any documentation to prove that. That's kind of the point. Where is he getting this new version from? What evidence is he getting to say that that's the truth? Why is it that this history? Because that means that all guys like Washington Irving, who had his own biases, I wouldn't even agree with his views on cosmology, but I quote him once again because it supports my view of this view of the globe coming in gradually. So I'm not afraid to quote him because it supports the view of history that I've laid out. How could Washington Irving, if he did even with his biases, if he did any historical research at all, how could he get that so wrong? And I believe that sometimes new scholarship and history comes up. Sometimes we got to overturn the old. I mean, I'm Reformed Truther Ministries. We've talked about how the contemporary view of flat Earth itself is controversial. The views we've laid out on other topics on this channel, the Nephilim or ancient history, whatever. There are times where, yes, we need to say that the view that's been promoted for a long time may not be the right one. But the point I'm trying to make is there's got to be evidence. You got to back that up. There's got to be evidence to back that up. Faulkner has not done that in terms of the Columbus debate. He doesn't want us to believe that there were theologians living in Spain who were debating Columbus, because that doesn't go along with his greater view that everybody for the past 2,000 years believed in a globe Earth. Now, let me read this quotation from the back of the book of his book here again, because this is where he's going. This is the agenda he's laying out. Unfortunately, as flat Earth websites proliferated on the internet, thousands of people soon joined the movement. It is ironic that more people in the West today believe the Earth is flat than have in 2 millennia. That's the view he's arguing for. Nobody believed this at all. And so he has to go through all this history, and he's got to do all these somersaults to prove that there was nobody who believed it, because his book relies on, he doesn't want people to fairly consider the flat Earth arguments, because I think he knows there's weight to them. So you got to go to ad hominem logical attacks. You have to go to ridicule. You got to make it seem so stupid that's a lot of what this book's arguments are based on. This is stupid. You shouldn't give any consideration to all. This is dangerous. There's a word. And what he's saying is not even people for 2,000 years. Essentially nobody believes in this. And he'll concede a little bit here and again. Guys like Lantanthius or Cosmas, he'll concede those two individuals. Some stuff he'll explain away, like the Josephus quote we looked at. But here's my point, is that he's saying nobody believed in this. So when we get to stuff like the Columbus stuff, this is where the revisionism comes in. They're moving from, now they've got everybody to believe in the globe. Now they want to get you to believe that everybody throughout history believed that. So see how the story gets twisted even more and even more and even more. And that's not what the older historians argumented for. So if you're going to make your case of this newer view of the Columbus story, you got to back that up. And there's a lot more I could say on that, but there's a lot about Columbus that's interesting that we haven't even gotten into. And let me make this last comment, and then we'll move forward to the maps, because we're already at 54 minutes, is that the point here is that Columbus, he was a member of he was a member of the secret societies. And we talked about this in my videos, the Zionist Jesuit connection. You can go back and watch those. And I talked about how Columbus was a member of a successor order to the Knights of Christ, or the Knights Templar, called the Knights of Christ in Portugal. And he seems to have been initiated into these views. And these views of the Greek philosophers that this is a pagan cosmology. You got to understand that the Greek cosmology, that's what the globe Earth is. It's a Greek pagan cosmology, and we could argue if it even goes further back into the mystery schools and all of that. But Columbus, it makes sense that historically he advocated for that because he was initiated into those schools. And we remember that when he sailed west of the New World, he had those 3 red Templar crosses on his 3 ships. So that is the context of it. And Faulkner's right about one thing in that quotation I read, that sailing to the New World did not prove that the Earth is a globe. And I know some people may say, well, what about circumnavigation? Yes, circumnavigation is possible on a flat Earth. It doesn't prove the globe. And this could be something we could talk about in more detail in the future when we get to the empirical arguments, but that the North is the geographic center of our world. And this will be a good transition into our maps that we're going to look at next. Actually, let me pull this map up. So I'm going to make this argument. So here, this map is the Gleason New Standard Map from 1892, and I believe this is one of the more reliable, from a flat Earth perspective, one of the more reliable maps that we have. And this gives us the best idea of, at this point, what we believe the world really looks like. And the idea here would be that the North is the geographic center of our round circular disk, and that if you go east to west, you can go, roughly around these continents. And that if you're using a compass for travel, and it's amazing when you look at a compass, it looks just like a disc, just like the surface of this. So that amazes me how when you look at a compass in light of this map, this flat Earth map, it makes so much sense that the North is the center, the South is the opposite of the center, which is the edges. So going east or west would take you in a circle, depending on the respective direction of which way you go. And so the men who did successfully circumnavigate the Earth would have been Francis Drake and Magellan. I think, let me switch the order because Magellan did it first. Magellan and then Francis Drake. And yes, they would have went, because they went south and they went around the tip of South America. And then they went west across the Pacific. And then they go back around, back around Africa and back up toward Europe again. Yes, it's possible to do that. It does not prove the globe view. And when you get into the details of that, circumnavigation is perfectly explainable on a flat Earth. I know some people are going to push back on that, but that is true. And so, yes, Columbus's story doesn't disprove the flat Earth at all. It doesn't prove the globe view at all, but it's a very interesting historical benchmark on all of this. But I thought pointing out some of that, how there's been revisionism with this story, is very important. Now, that being said, let's go to some maps here. Now, this is the map. We were talking about Isidore of Seville. This is a map that goes back to him. This is called a T&O map. And you have, once again, these 3 continents, and you have the ocean surrounding it, and it looks like a circular disc. So this would be an early medieval map. And that one's very interesting. And then if we go to this one, try not to go through these too fast. This is called the Psalter world map, and it portrays the world looking, once again, like a circular or like a disc in it. And you look at it, it looks kind of like a table, doesn't it? And then you see these people up here sitting around the table, and Jerusalem is very prominently portrayed at the center of this. And that's really what this map of the world is portraying. This is called the Psalter world map. You can look this one up. So let me go back to, so this one, once again, this is the T&O map. Let me just stay on this for a few seconds, let people look at it. And of course, you could pause this and look at this in your own time, or you can Google this. This one's the T&O map. I'm going back to this one for a moment. This one is the Psalter world map, portraying the world with Jerusalem at the center of the world, and it's portrayed like a disc, or it looks like a table that people are sitting around. And then one more here. This one is called the Hereford Mappus Mundi map. So once again, portraying a flat circle. Very interesting. Now, I want to show one here that just shows the world as a planisphere. I think I have, oh, did I get that one? Okay, I don't have that one, but if you look up you'll have to look up this one in your own time, but I was going to show this one from 1450 to, maybe I can still get it here, but it's called the Fra Mauro map. And that one, the Fra Mauro map, which that's 1450, that would start to show where the change starts to come. And the Fra Mauro map, I might be able to get it here, because this one it shows the world as a planisphere. I think I'll be able to get it here. Let's see. All right. So if I go back to, because I want to be objective, I want to be fair to make sure we get this right. Oh, perfect. Okay, so here's the Fra Mauro map. I was able to get it. Excellent. So this one, it's similar to the other ones, but it's important that this one, you can read the context of this, and I don't think this would be hotly debated amongst historians. This one starts to describe the Earth as a planisphere. So this is starting to, once again, early 15th century, late 16th century, you start to see this view of the world, this cosmology start to accelerate and pick up more steam. But compared to some of these other maps, that there are maps, once again, from the Middle Ages that did portray the world as flat. So the point that I've tried to make, and I'll repeat myself one more time for emphasis, is that I don't need to prove that everybody in history agreed to me. I'm just trying to disprove this statement by Faulkner that it's ironic that more people in the West today believe that the Earth is flat than have believed in it in 2 millennia. Let me just make my point one more time. You see me, I'm being a little facetious here, but nobody believed in this for 2,000 years. Okay, one more time. So I think you guys see my point. It's just to say historically, to say that anybody of any, I mean, because that's what his argument of his book is. Nobody who had any brains believed in this. So why are people today, based on misrepresentations and whatever else, are believing in that? That's not what the history bears out, and that's what I've tried to prove. So if I've proven one thing from this section, is that if you just think this whole movement of even if you disagree with it, if you think it's just a bunch of stupid people who haven't done any research, hopefully at this point, going through all this history and quoting all these books has proven that you can make an erudite case for our position. And I haven't even gotten to the biblical stuff yet. I haven't even gotten to the empirical stuff yet. But if you can't see that that's the point, then I don't know. I can't I can't help you. And that's kind of, it's the point is that if you're using the argument, this is just dumb and nobody believed in this, that argument does not hold water. But that being said, we're already over an hour. I'm going to try to keep this one under 90 minutes so that we can not keep it too long. But we've kind of moved forward from Isidore of Seville, 7th century. We've talked about Columbus, that's the 1400s. We've shown these maps from, this one would be 17th century, and then these two, I think, are 12 and 1300s. The Salter World Map and the Hereford Mappa Mundi. So you have early Middle Ages, and then you have more high Middle Ages. And then you have the Fra Mauro map, 1450. And then we get Copernicus's views, and I made the distinction that heliocentrism, even though it's based on, it's by necessity relies upon the view that the Earth is a globe, it also gets into the Earth going around the sun. But I want to mention Copernicus. His date for his work on the revolution of the heavenly spheres is 1543. And we talked about how Luther pushed back against that view, and he pushed back against the globe view as a whole. We quoted him to prove that. Now let's get into, what did John Calvin believe? And Calvin is very important for the Reform view, and this will be where we're going to end our video today. So Faulkner quotes Calvin in one place only, based on what is cited in his appendix. Or not his appendix, his index, excuse me. But on page 282 of his book on Calvin, and now he's trying to refute the idea of a solid firmament, and he quotes Calvin here. So he says, let anyone think, let me back up here. He's trying to make a case here that the idea that the raka is a solid, referring to us in Genesis chapter 1, is referring to a solid dome covering, is false. So he says, this is why many modern translations of the Bible render raka as expanse rather than firmament. So there's the context. We'll talk about that more when we get to the biblical arguments. But he says, lest anyone thinks this is a modern imposition, consider the words of John Calvin. And then he says, the work of the second day is, this is Calvin here, the work of the second day is to provide an empty space around the circumference of the earth, that heaven and earth may not be mixed together. For since the proverb, quote, to mingle heaven and earth denotes the extreme disorder, this distinction ought to be regarded as of great importance. Moreover, the word rakia comprehends not only to the whole region of the air, but whatever is open above us. The word heaven is sometimes understood by the Latins. Thus, the arrangement as well as of the heavens and as of the lower atmosphere is called rakia, without discrimination between them. But sometimes the word signifies both together, sometimes one part only, and will appear more plainly in our progress. I know not why the Greeks have chosen to render the word stereoma, which the Latins have imitated in the term firmamentum, for it literally means expanse. So basically, Faulkner, he's using Calvin to support his idea that the rakia of Genesis is referring to, he's saying it refers to the expanse of the air, and there's no such thing as a solid dome covering. So let me go here to Calvin's commentary on Genesis, because I believe that it's going to give us some real insight into what's going on here. Genesis chapter 1, because I think if you read just that part, it doesn't really get into, it doesn't fairly completely represent what Calvin believes. We're going to read from Calvin's Institutes where he and Faulkner doesn't even mention this. Calvin has a quotation where he flatly ridicules Plato for holding to a round globe view. So even if Calvin, and I would even be willing to concede this, just as I said this may be the case with Luther, if he doesn't hold to a solid firmament, but he's got an understanding of the heavens moving around a flat earth cosmology, which I think is, that may be the case for him based on this quotation, it really doesn't debunk, it really doesn't set me back at all, because he doesn't hold to Faulkner's view. I would say much closer to my view than the Faulkner's, but Faulkner doesn't even represent that. He gives us one quotation and he makes it seem like that's the entirety of what Calvin believed, but it really doesn't do a great job of showing his view at all. But here, let me scroll down here to what Calvin says about the gathering of the waters together, which is very, very interesting. Okay, so we're going to quote here from verse 9, Calvin's commentaries on Genesis chapter 1. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 9. And Calvin said, let the waters be gathered together. This is also an illustrious miracle, that the waters by their departure have given a dwelling place to men. For even philosophers allow that the natural position of the waters was to cover the whole earth, as Moses declared they did in the beginning. First beginning an element, it must be circular, because this element is heavier than the air and lighter than the earth. It ought to cover the latter in its whole circumference. So we notice that Calvin used that same word circumference, talking about that above, but now listen to how he's using it here. It ought to cover the latter in its whole circumference, but the seas being gathered together on heaps should give place for man is seemingly preternatural, and therefore Scripture often extols the goodness of God in this particular. See Psalms 33:7. He gathered the waters together on a heap and laid them up as his treasures. He collected the water as into a bottle. That's Psalm 78:13. Jeremiah 5:22. Will you not fear me? Will you not tremble at my presence? For I have placed the sand as the boundary of the sea. And he quotes Job 38:8. Who has shut up the seas with doors? Have I not surrounded it with gates and bars? I have said, hitherto thou shalt now proceed. Here shall thy swelling waves be broken. So, Calvin, so yeah, he talks about how he thinks he does, I'll concede that yeah, he does seem to say that the air above is referring to this expanse. This firmament is referring to this expanse, but then he talks about these gathering of the waters together as a miracle. These waters that are then surrounding the dry earth. It's very similar to Luther's view. And there's some other quotations here that I can give that even are stronger than this, that Faulkner doesn't even mention. I'm going to go here if I go to Calvin's commentaries and I go to the book of Psalms, and Psalm 93, Calvin in his comments, it really explicitly talks about how the earth does not move at all. This is Calvin, Psalm 93, verse 1. Jehovah is reign, and we here see what I have lately adverted to, that in the power of God there is exhibited to us manner of confidence for our not investing God with the power which belongs to him as we ought to do, and thus wickedly despoiling him of his authority, is the source of that fear and trembling which we very often experience. This, it is true, we dare not do openly, but were we well persuaded of his invincible power, that would be to us an invincible support against all the assaults of temptation. All in admit in word what the prophet here teaches, that God reigns. But how few are there who oppose the shield to the hostile powers of the world, as it becoming them to do, that they may fear nothing, however terrible. In this then consists the glory of God, that he governs mankind according to his will. It is said he clothes himself with majesty and strength. Not that we ought to imagine that there is anything in him which is derived from another, but it is intended by the effect and indubitable experience to show his wisdom and righteousness in the government of mankind. The psalmist proves that God will not neglect or abandon the world from the fact that he created it. A simple survey of the world should of itself suffice to attest the divine providence. The heavens revolve daily and immense in their fabric, and inconceivable the rapidity of their revolutions. We experience no concussion, no disturbance in the harmony of their motion. The sun, though varying in its course every diurnal revolution, returns annually to the same point. The planets in all their wanderings maintain their respective positions. How could the earth hang suspended in the air were it not upheld by God's hand? By what means could it maintain itself unmoved while the heavens above are in their constant rapid motion? Did not its maker fix an establishment according to the principle, or according to the participle, and he quotes the Hebrew denoting emphasis is introduced. Yea, he has established it. So Calvin in that quotation is saying that the earth does not move, but the heavenly bodies above and around do. He's saying the earth does not move, but the heavenly bodies do, in flat contradiction to the heliocentric model. And then the question becomes, well, was Calvin, you could say, well, did he hold to a round earth geocentric view? Well, let me finish up here by quoting. I'm going to quote from the Institutes, and then we're going to be done, because this is already a long video. So this is John Calvin's most famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And in the Reformed tradition, the Reformed theological tradition, and me as a particular Baptist, I would subscribe to this broader Reformed tradition. Calvin is a very important theologian in church history, and that's pretty much, I would say, people who have studied church history would recognize that, and that would not be disputed. So this is the Institutes of the Christian Religion is his most famous book. This, and alongside his commentaries, those are really the main works of his scholarship. So this is what he says this is book 1, or the first book. This is chapter 5, and this is paragraph 11. So when I give that citation, you can find it regardless of which English translation there are. And this one here is the translation by Henry Beveridge. I'll give that as well. This was put Hendrickson Publishers put this one out. There's also I believe it's the Battle translation in English, but like I said, you should be able to find it with that citation, book 1, chapter 5, paragraph 11. And this is what Calvin says. He says, to say nothing of the others whose absurdity are of a still grosser description, how completely does Plato, the soberest and most religious of them all, lose himself in his round globe? And I'm going to stop there. That's the whole context of the quotation. But Calvin is saying, as great as Plato is in some ways, as intelligent or as wise as Plato may be in some areas, as a great philosopher from history, Calvin is saying that his view of this little round globe is absurd and ridiculous. So Calvin is pushing back hard against Plato's view, because I believe that Calvin believed that view was Greek pagan, and that's what it is, and more importantly, non-biblical. So when you look at what he said about the earth not moving, what he wrote about the gathering the waters together, even if he does not hold to the solid firmament the way that I would like him to, and we want to represent Calvin accurately, I would say that Faulkner is only he took one specific quotation which seemed to help him, and he didn't give any other context from the rest of Calvin's writing, and he's presenting once again a partial botched view of Calvin, just like he did with Luther and Aquinas and all the rest of it. So really the last thing I want to say, guys, before we wrap up, is these guys don't all, even if they broadly agree with you, we've seen this from reading all these quotes from history, guys don't always articulate every little thing the way that I would or I would want them to. In history, you got to try hard to see the big picture. So yeah, so if maybe Calvin doesn't hold that view of the solid firmament, which that would be what that quotation that Faulkner used seems to say, and I'm fine with that. But you also got to say he believed that the earth doesn't move, and he flatly pushed back against the round view of Plato. So with Luther and Calvin, it does seem that their views of the heavens was a little bit different than how I would articulate it. And we talked about that in part 1 with Luther too. But we also had very explicit quotations where they talk about the dry land being surrounded by these waters that God has pulled back. And they understood the importance of those verses, such as Isaiah 40:22 or Proverbs 8 talks about the waters being pulled back. These guys who were very biblically literate men, they understood those concepts. But the point I want to make to wrap up is that we do need to understand that these guys we have to be careful when doing historical research. These guys don't always articulate the jot and tittle exactly as we do. And so we have to be very, very careful when looking at their writings to be objective, to get it right. But I hope at this point, at the very least, I've demonstrated, even if you disagree with my position on cosmology, you can say that Faulkner has not accurately represented the history, and that he has not fairly represented the issues. And this will only become more evident when we get into the other sections of the book. But this is going to wrap up. This is part 3, and this is going to wrap up the historical section of this series. And then we are going to move into the biblical arguments next. So all that being said, this is Joe Harper, and this has been Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.